With the divisions within Buganda now deeper than ever, the kingdom's trajectory was now more uncertain than ever. What would happen next would change the course of history in the Great Lakes region forever. But what would the future hold? How would things unfold? Come with me. This is Ourstory, Uganda. As the world rotates quietly, Jared Portal, the British Special Envoy to Buganda, who had been sent to the kingdom to determine if it was worth colonizing, lies dead. Gone, before he could present his evaluation of the kingdom to the British Parliament. His final act, however, a meticulously written report, along with 2 letters. One written by Alfred Tucker, the Anglican Bishop of Eastern Equatorial Africa, and the other by Bishop Hirth of the Catholic White Fathers, would find their way into the corridors of the British Parliament, sparking passionate and spirited deliberations and debates among members of Parliament. Both missionaries, like Portal, pushed for Britain to officially colonize Buganda. Nearly 5 months after Portal's death, on June 18th of 1894, Archibald Primrose, the 5th Earl of Rosebery, the former British Foreign Secretary, who just 2 years prior had fought so hard in Parliament in support of the official colonization of Buganda, and had recently replaced Gladstone as Britain's Prime Minister, appeared before Parliament and proceeded to announce that Buganda was now officially a British protectorate. A little over 2 months after Primrose's proclamation, on August 20th of 1894, Kabaka, Mwanga, and the Ochiko were finally informed that Buganda was now officially a British colony. With the help of Bishop Alfred Tucker of the CMS and Joseph Hurt of the White Fathers, Portal had managed to broker a deal between the Uganda Catholics and Protestants in his short stay, which would calm the tension and lead to a significant lessening in bad blood and hostility between these 2 Christian factions. The Protestants had agreed to assign more land to the Catholics. They gave them Buwekula, Mawapata, and parts of Sese Islands. The Catholics, having been confined to just Wudu going into the negotiations, left them content and less combative. Like the Catholics, the Muslims were also extremely disgruntled by the small amount of land that had been assigned to them by the Protectorate, so they took every measure to agitate for more land. Unlike the Catholics, however, whose concerns were listened to and addressed, the Protectorate, after consulting with the 2 Christian factions, enraged the Muslims when they outright rejected their demands and refused to even consider the matter. Ill-advised, a few angry Muslims rebelled against the Protectorate and resolved to assign themselves more land, by all means necessary. The Protectorate, however, after being tipped off on the Muslims' intentions, would deploy Captain MacDonald and Sameka Konglu on the Muslims, and would stamp out their rebellion even before it could get off the ground and pick up steam. While the exact number of deaths and casualties suffered by the Muslims in this skirmish is unknown, what is for certain is that the Muslims were dealt a severe blow by the Protectorate. Several leading Muslims, including Prince Imbogo, who had taken over the leadership of the Muslims after the death of his brother, Kabaka, were captured in November of 1893. The assault on the Muslims, however, would lead to some unforeseen consequences, particularly when it came to the Protectorate Sudanese soldiers, many of whom also identified as Muslims. Conflicted about his involvement in the Protectorate's attack on the Uganda Muslims, a Sudanese soldier worried the Protectorate when he tacitly declared his brotherhood with the Uganda Muslims, when he mentioned that the Protectorate's attack on the Muslims was distressing to him and felt like a direct attack on himself. The British Protectorate feared that this was not an isolated sentiment and that many other Sudanese mercenaries may in fact also feel this way. Consequently, when Henry Colville was appointed the Commissioner to Uganda, succeeding the interim Commissioner James MacDonald, he was dispatched with several British soldiers who were fluent in Arabic and could communicate directly with the Sudanese. By cutting out interpreters, the British Protectorate hoped that it would now be better positioned to address any issues that might arise more immediately, and in so doing, improve its interactions and relationship with its Sudanese mercenaries. Colville's main mandate, however, from the British government was to debilitate Kabalega, vanquish his people, and to bring Bunyoro into the Protectorate's fold. In December of 1893, a heavily armed Colville marched into Mparo, Bunyoro's capital, with a force consisting of 8 European officers, 400 Sudanese, and upwards of 15,000 Buganda troops under the command of Semeika Kungu. They were interestingly accompanied by George Pilkington and a few other CMS missionaries. While Colville had calculated that it would encounter some form of resistance from Kabalega at the Kafu River, and surely in Bunyoro's capital Mparo, and had accordingly strategically prepared, he would be surprised to find that Kabalega had evacuated his troops from both areas, and no such resistance was forthcoming. Knowing he stood no chance going toe-to-toe against the British Protectorate, having lost several battles against them, ahead of Colville's arrival, Kabalega had ordered his subjects to evacuate the capital, Mparo, and take to the natural caves in Katasiha, hoping that the caves would serve as a perfect bunker to retaliate and fend off the Protectorate. The caves, however, would prove not to be as strong a barricade as Kabalega and his men had hoped. Not only was the destruction and damage caused by the Protectorate's Maxim guns devastating, forcing the Nyoro warriors to retreat even deeper into the caves and preventing them from launching their own counter-offensive, but it also softened up their defenses enough and made way for Colville and the British Protectorate's forces to infiltrate their cover positions and engage them in close-range combat. Within a few days of intense fighting, after having suffered many deaths and casualties, Kabalega and his men were smoked out of the Katasiha caves and chased off, forced to take cover not too far away in Budongo Forest. As a new tactic of engagement, which they hoped would give them a puncher's chance against the Protectorate's forces, Kabalega split his warriors into smaller units, assigned a commander to each of the units, and gave them permission to operate and make decisions independently. The units were deployed all over Bunyoro, and strategically along known British supply routes, to ambush the Protectorate's caravans on the move and give them reason to constantly look over their shoulders. The Nyoro presently embraced guerrilla warfare, coming to terms with the fact that it might have been the only tactic that would give them a fighting chance against the British. Small-scale hit-and-run attacks became the new norm in Bunyoro's war against the British Protectorate. The Nyoro made it almost impossible for the British to move even a few meters away from their garrisons without being attacked. Meanwhile, Kakungu Kakungu and his men pillaged and took possession of all they could make away with from Bunyoro, taking a great deal of livestock, ivory, guns, and ammunition. A significant amount of land in southern Bunyoro, most of which had been deserted by the Nyoro after Colville and Kakungu's devastating assault, was also taken as part of the spoils. Serving as a token of appreciation for his loyalty to the British Protectorate, the land was temporarily put under the stewardship of Kakungu. The new territory, together with ivory, guns, and livestock that he continued to acquire, particularly after he had been appointed Chimbugwe, made Kakungu a man of immense wealth. Serving in part as an opportunity to show off his newfound wealth, in October of 1894, Kakungu married Princess Nakalema, Kabaka Mwanga's sister, and threw a wedding reception the likes of which in extravagance and immensity had never been seen in Buganda. The commandeered land in southern Bunyoro would eventually be transferred to Uganda, split between the Uganda Protestants and Catholics by Colville's successor Ernest Buckley, further entrenching the Protestants and Catholics' social standing in the Protectorate, and symbolizing how they were favorably treated by the British. Dubbed the Lost Counties, the land would become an issue of intense contention between Buganda and Bunyoro for decades to come. The role of Christian missionaries at facilitating the conquest of the peoples of the Great Lakes region should never be underestimated. Nearly all the administrators the British appointed could not speak Swahili, much less Luganda, and consequently they were highly dependent on CMS missionaries, and in some occasions the White Fathers, for translations. The missionaries tagged along with Lugard upon his arrival, and with MacDonald, and then Colville, and with every British administrator and commissioner who followed. Some historians have suggested that many of these early Christian missionaries to the region were semi-political, and in many cases agents of British imperialism. Not only had they made a habit out of escorting the Protectorate's forces during their onslaughts against perceived adversaries, but they also were quick to report the natives to the Protectorate's administration if they heard of any plots that could compromise their authority. Several plots against the Protectorate by disgruntled Uganda were foiled on intelligence provided to the Protectorate by these missionaries. Not even the Catholic confessional guaranteed that one's deepest secrets and confessions would be held in confidence. By the mid-1890s, Kabaka Mwanga had been reduced to a mere figurehead in Buganda, and had little to no say on how his kingdom operated. His opinion no longer carried the weight it once did. Real power now lay in the hands of the commissioner. Worse yet, Mwanga's own subjects, the likes of Apolokagwa, Semeka Kungulu, Stanislas Mugwanya, and a few others within the kingdom, seemed to wield more power than him. The Sudanese Mutiny of 1897 was the first and biggest threat yet to the Protectorate's administration. Agitated after several months had passed without getting paid, in October of 1897, a regiment of Sudanese mercenaries at a camp in Busoga had turned their guns on the Protectorate, killing a young British commander named Arthur Thurston, and taking possession of a Maxim gun. The news of the happenings in Busoga was very unsettling and disconcerting to the Protectorate. Desperate to put an end to the skirmish, the Protectorate asked for reinforcements to be deployed to the region at once from the British Indian Army. Indian troops were experienced and well seasoned at putting out similar uprisings. They had recently been deployed to Egypt and to Sudan, and performed very well there. With no delay, the British Indian administration agreed to help, immediately deploying upwards of 400 soldiers to the Protectorate. The Indians' experience was evident from the onset. They would hit the ground running upon their arrival, joining the thousands of Uganda troops who had already been deployed to Busoga. After just weeks of intense combat, the Protectorate managed to dislodge the mutineers from Chief Lula's territory in Mayuge and sent them scampering. The Protectorate's battle against the mutineers was a ruthless bloodbath. When the dust had settled, both sides had incurred many deaths. The mutineers had incurred upwards of 500 deaths, while the Protectorate had lost over 280 of its troops, of which a whopping 56 of them were Indian and 7 were British. Meanwhile, Mwanga had secretly gone about plotting a revolt against the Protectorate. By some accounts, Mwanga had even commissioned Charles Stokes, a missionary-turned gun trader, to supply him with firearms. Stokes, however, had been captured by the Belgians in Congo during a gun run and executed in 1895. Little is known about how many guns Stokes supplied to Mwanga. It is also curious if Mwanga hired another gun runner after Stokes' execution. Notwithstanding, by mid-1897, Mwanga believed he had stockpiled enough weapons and mobilized enough of his loyalists to finally confront the Protectorate. In the cover of darkness, on July 6th of 1897, an emboldened Mwanga sneaked out of his palace in Bengal and set out for Uddu, a Catholic stronghold, where most of his die-hard loyalists had assembled. In Uddu, Mwanga would assemble upwards of 14,000 men, willing to put their lives on the line on his behalf, of whom an estimated 3,000 were armed with firearms. Little did Mwanga know, but his plot had already been foiled, and the Protectorate was already onto him. It appears that one of his loyalists had unwittingly confessed about Mwanga's imminent attack to Father Streicher during a Catholic confessional. And not surprisingly, Father Streicher reported Mwanga to Major Tarnan, the acting commissioner to the Protectorate. Tarnan wasted no time bracing himself for Mwanga's attack and plotting his own counter-offensive. Within no time, he had mobilized upwards of 7,000 troops to help him repel Mwanga, of whom ironically, as had become custom, upwards of 95% of them were Buganda. It was clear from the onset that Mwanga was in for an uphill battle, and it would have to punch well above his weight to worry the Protectorate. For one, he was significantly outgunned. Not only did all 7,000 of Tarnan's troops carry firearms, but they also, as had become customary on such Protectorate offensives, had 2 Maxim guns in tow. Moreover, the Protectorate's army was much more formidable now than ever, and would be a force to be reckoned with. The formation of the Uganda Rifles in September of 1895 had brought about a culture that prioritized structure and discipline. With a much improved recruiting process and better training, the Protectorate's army was now stronger and more dangerous than ever. It did not take long for the Protectorate's army to neutralize and debilitate Mwanga's uprising. Within a matter of weeks, Mwanga and his troops had been beaten decisively and forced to withdraw from their positions. The Protectorate's army was unrelenting in its pursuit. It chased after them, drove them out of Uddu and from the Protectorate altogether, forcing them to cross the Kagera River into present-day Tanzania, which at the time was under German control. Little did Mwanga know, but he had escaped the frying pan only to end up in the fire. To his annoyance, no sooner had he crossed the Kagera River into Tanzania than the Germans captured him and took him hostage. While there's not much on record on his experience under German captivity, in January of 1898, after 5 months in custody, Mwanga miraculously managed to escape. He fled north, settling in Kochi, a neighboring kingdom south of Uganda that just 2 years prior had been annexed into the protectorate, and went back to the drawing board. Meanwhile, Kabalega had been forced out of Bunyoro altogether. He had crossed the Nile and landed in Lango, where a Lange chief named Adora was so courteous as to provide him with an asylum within his province. As he went about contemplating his next move, Kabalega was approached with a proposition by the Sudanese mutineers that he could not refuse. They suggested that they should form an alliance with Kabalega and take on the British together. With the protectorate's troops nipping at their heels in hot pursuit after their mutiny at Chief Luba's in Busoga had been squashed, the Sudanese had scurried off and taken cover not too far away from where Kabalega and his surviving diehards had hunkered down. As a testament to how good the intelligence they had been getting from the protectorate on Kabalega's whereabouts was, they knew what general area he was in, and eventually they were able to find him. They found him resigned to despair and in a state of desperation, willing to listen to any ideas that could help him keep hope alive. Needless to say, it did not take much convincing for Kabalega to agree and get on board with the Sudanese. The Sudanese arrival was an immense boost to Kabalega's fighting spirit and determination to continue fighting the British and take back control of his kingdom. What they lacked in numbers, the Sudanese made up for with their experience in combat. They were much more seasoned fighters than Kabalega's men. Not to mention, they had also served shoulder to shoulder with the British and knew their tactics. Meanwhile, another unprecedented union, albeit one that was not too surprising considering the happenings in the region at the time, was in the works and on the cusp of being locked in. Upon escaping from German captivity, Kabaka Mwanga had swallowed his pride and reached out to Kabalega with a proposition that they should bury the hatchet with each other, put their differences aside, and combine their forces to fight the British. This is how hopeless and desperate the situation in the Great Lakes region had become. Just a decade prior, no one could have ever imagined that these two great rulers, who were sworn enemies, could ever have amicable dealings with each other, let alone entertain the idea of combining their forces to fight a shared enemy. But yet here they were, at their wits' end, both expelled from their respective kingdoms, and willing to do whatever it took to turn the tables on the British protectorate. Ironically, the British had found their way to the Great Lakes region on an invitation by Kabaka to Christian missionaries in 1875. By some accounts, Mutesa hoped the missionaries would supply him with guns and other modern weaponry, which he desperately needed to fend off his adversaries, the most feared of whom was Bunyoro. He could not have predicted that within 2 decades of their arrival, the British would not only have vanquished Bunyoro, but they would have also taken down his own kingdom, and would now be reigning supreme over the entire Great Lakes region. While Kabalega thought that much of the blame for the British invasion fell on Buganda's shoulders, he was desperate to turn the tide in the British protectorate, and resultingly, he invoked the ancient adage, "The enemy of my enemy is a friend," and agreed to form an alliance with Mwanga. For the first time on record, the Omukama of Bunyoro and the Kabaka of Buganda, albeit both displaced from their respective thrones at the time, would form an alliance to fight a shared enemy. When Mwanga and his men got word that Kabalega was just as eager to combine his troops with theirs, they were overjoyed and filled with excitement, chomping at the bit to return to the battleground. They wasted no time gathering their weapons and starting north towards Bunyoro, where they would join Ireta and Chikukule, two of Kabalega's most fearless chiefs, in their battle against the British. They had been going at it with the British since the early months of 1890. Mwanga and his men's arrival was such an immense boost to Ireta and Chikukule's offensive that in January of 1898, the combined forces had made some inroads against the British, handing them a few severe beatings against all odds, and forcing them out of much of the kingdom. The British, however, by now, were so invested in Bunyoro that they were not about to roll over and concede defeat that easily. They had every intention of returning to the battleground and retaliating. And lo and behold, within weeks, they were back to Bunyoro, and back with vengeance. The Maxim guns, yet again, were weapons they had no answer for and could not overcome. They would suffer many deaths and casualties in the battles that ensued. By the end of March of 1898, the tables had been turned in the Protectorate's favor. The momentum the three great warriors had gained had been brought to a screeching halt, and the Protectorate had taken back control of much of the kingdom. Between June and July of 1898, the 27th Bombay Light Infantry was deployed to Bunyoro to patrol the area and clear it up of any remnants of adversarial forces. Chased out of Bunyoro by the Protectorate, Mwanga and his surviving men were forced to cross the river now, landing on the east bank of the river in Lango, where they would finally link up with Kabalega. Little did Mwanga know, but his decision to link up with Kabalega in Lango would prove to be disastrous and ill-advised. By meeting in Lango, the two great rulers had effectively cut themselves off from the rest of the Protectorate and cornered themselves, and in so doing made it easier for the British to fight them in containment without fear that they could elude capture and slip back into their respective kingdoms. The British were unrelenting in their pursuit and determination to take down Mwanga and Kabalega once and for all. They knew that eliminating the two great rulers would serve a major blow to the morale of their diehard loyalists and would help pave the way for them to finally solidify their grip on power in the region. To this end, in March of 1898, the British sent reinforcements to the region and ramped up their hunt for Mwanga and Kabalega. They deployed Lieutenant Colonel John Thorold Evetts to the Protectorate with upwards of 400 troops from the Bombay Light Infantry under his command. Evetts set out for Lango as soon as he got to the Protectorate, setting up camp not too far away from where he had gotten intelligence that Mwanga and Kabalega were hiding. Two contingents of Uganda troops, one led by Sameka Kongulu and the other by Luwandaga Chimbugwe, were also deployed to Lango alongside Evetts. The attack couldn't have come at a worse time for Mwanga and Kabalega. Their coalition with the Sudanese had been majorly weakened in December of 1898, when Bilal Amin, the leader of the Sudanese mercenaries, who had been a critical piece in the negotiations that led up to the Sudanese combining their forces with the two great rulers, and was the glue that kept many of the Sudanese attached to the coalition, was killed on the battleground. To no surprise, many of the Sudanese who had been operating under his command lost their morale to fight and abandoned the mission after his death. Meanwhile, the Protectorate kept closing in on Mwanga and Kabalega. Acting on a tip from a Lange informant, on the morning of April 9th of 1899, Evans, Kakungulu, and Luwandaga ambushed Mwanga and Kabalega's camp. Rudely awakened by the sounds of gunshots and commotion within their camp, Mwanga and Kabalega were caught completely off guard. A disoriented Mwanga apparently surrendered immediately, raising the white flag when he realized that they were completely surrounded and stood no chance. The defiant Omukama, however, was determined not to be taken down without a fight. Staying true to bona fide Bunyoro warrior customs, he was determined never to be captured alive. With his son Jassi by his side, Kabalega bravely fired back at the Protectorate's forces as they advanced upon him. They, however, were severely outmanned and outgunned, and were well over their heads thinking they stood a chance against the Protectorate. Unable to shoot their way out of the situation, they were eventually backed into a swamp in Kangai, Dokolo. After having sustained some seriously debilitating injuries, here's where the fugitives' brave fight would finally come to an end. The great Omukama had been struck by a bullet in his right arm and another in his left hand. He could barely hold his gun. Jassi had also been shot. His injuries, however, were much more severe than his father's, and he was barely holding on to life. Defeated and incapacitated, the Omukama and his son were apprehended, and together with Mwanga, who had surrendered almost as soon as he realized that they were under siege, were taken captive. Shortly after their capture, the captives were marched to Kampala, escorted by a large contingent of Uganda rifles, led by Sameka Kungulu and Andrea Luwandaga. The Omukama was carried on a stretcher for most of the journey, while the Kabaka and the rest of the captives followed along on foot at gunpoint. Jassi would succumb to his wounds on the march to Kampala. The capture of the two great rulers was the nail in the coffin on the struggle for sovereignty against the British in the Great Lakes region, marking the beginning of a new era in the region, in which the British had major influence on who the future rulers of these preeminent kingdoms would be, and how they governed. In Buganda, they had appointed Mwanga's infant son, Daudi Chwa, the Kabaka, in 1897, right after Mwanga had declared war against the Protectorate. And in Bunyoro, they had appointed Yosia Katayimbwa, one of Kabalega's sons, the Omukama, in 1898 after false claims that Kabalega had died. The Omukama and Kabaka's presence in the Protectorate would eventually become a cause for concern for the British. News that they were being held captive by the Protectorate and mistreated incensed their loyal subjects. Even those who were not so loyal were riled up when they heard of the conditions their fallen rulers were being subjected to. Their die-hard loyalists in Buganda and Bunyoro would not be quieted. Their demands for their release kept growing louder and louder. Fearing that their demands could turn violent if the two kings remained held in bondage within the protectorate, the British decided to banish both rulers from their respective kingdoms and from the protectorate altogether. Just a month after their capture, on May 11th of 1899, Mwanga and Kabalega were boarded upon a steamer at Kusabala and sailed across Lake Victoria to Kisumu in present-day Kenya. From Kisumu, the captives were marched to Kismayo, an Indian Ocean coastline town located in present-day Somalia. They would be held in Kismayo for 2 years, before the British moved them to their permanent detention home in the Seychelles Islands. Just 2 years after arriving to Seychelles, in 1903, Mwanga passed away. Kabalega would remain exiled in Seychelles until 1923, when the British administration finally granted him permission to return to the protectorate. Unfortunately, the great Omukama would die before reaching Bunyoro. Kabalega took his last breath on April 5th of 1923 in Busoga, in a place that was since appropriately named Mpumude. Within months of banishing Mwanga from Buganda, on March 10th of 1900, a treaty dubbed the 1900 Buganda Agreement, which would entrench British rule in Buganda and forever change the social and political landscape of the kingdom, was entered into between the British and Buganda. The treaty was signed by Apollo Kabaka, Stanislas Mugwanya, and Zakaria Chisingiri on behalf of Buganda and its toddler Kabaka Daudi Chwa, and Harry Johnston, the British High Commissioner to Buganda, on behalf of the British. The terms of the agreement, once again, as had become customary, were very one-sided, intended to tighten Britain's dominion over Buganda, all the while continuing to appease Britain's Ganda agents of imperialism, who had betrayed their kingdom and were now more concerned with advancing their own personal aspirations. As part of the terms, for native administration, the kingdom was divided into 20 sazas. At the head of each was placed a chief. Chiefs would be tasked with administering justice, collecting taxes, upkeeping main roads, and supervising native affairs. Candidates for chieftaincy were to be nominated by the Uchiko, but could only assume their positions at the approval of Her Majesty's representative. Hut and gun taxes of 3 rupees per annum were to be paid by those who had a dwelling in the kingdom or owned a gun. Exceptions were made for the regents, county chiefs, members of the Uchiko, and a few royals. Should the kingdom fail to pay the protectorate's administration during the first 2 years, an amount of native taxation equal to half of what is due in proportion to the number of inhabitants, without just cause or excuse, or should the Kabaka, chiefs, or people of Uganda pursue a policy deemed to be disloyal to the British protectorate, Her Majesty's government will no longer consider themselves bound by the terms of this agreement. On the other hand, should the revenue exceed 2 years running, a total value of £45,000, the Kabaka, his native ministers and chiefs, could appeal to Her Majesty's government for an increase in subsidy. Buganda's land, an estimated 19,600 square miles, which had always belonged to the Kabaka, hence the title Sabataka, and was never privately owned, was to be split into Milo land and Crown land. Milo land was given to the Kabaka, his family, his regents, and local chiefs. and Crown land, an estimated 10,550 square miles, which was more than half the land the kingdom occupied, was to be allotted to the Protectorate's government for public use, and was now deemed the property of the Queen of Great Britain. For the first time in Buganda's history, land became a commodity, and the land distribution that ensued has been referred to by some historians as the first and biggest land grab scheme in Buganda. The regents and Saza chiefs systematically went about assigning Buganda's land to their relatives, their friends, their children, including those who were yet to be born. When all was said and done, the vital land in Buganda had been divided amongst a mere 300 families. The introduction of cash crops not long thereafter would usher in a new phenomenon, where there was a wide discrepancy in wealth accumulation and consequently social mobility between those who possessed land and those who did not. Similar treaties, although bare-bone and not quite as spelled out as Buganda's, were signed with Toro on June 26th of 1900 and with Ankole on October 25th, 1901. No such treaty was signed with Bunyoro. The terms of the Buganda Agreement served as the blueprint and provided the guardrails for the Protectorate's administration and governance of Bunyoro. By the close of the 19th century, the British had managed to infiltrate many, if not all, the kingdoms and tribes within the region. At the helm of the kingdoms and tribes they had vanquished, they had placed child kings and chiefs, who they then went on to claim were not old enough to rule, and consequently went on to assign regents to them. Most of these regents had sold out to the British and abandoned their ideals, and could be counted on to do the Protectorate's bidding. With Toro, Ankole, Bunyoro, Buganda, and Busoga now securely under the umbrella of the Protectorate, the British now turned their attention to expanding the boundaries of the Protectorate, with their eyes fixed on the tribes that lay east of Busoga, in a wide area the locals called Bukeddi, which encompassed a number of tribes, including Bugwere, Busamia, Bunyore, Iteso, Bugisu, and Japadola. With the promise of grandeur, fame, and prominence, the turn of the 19th century ushered in a phenomenon where many Gunda and other natives from surrounding tribes and kingdoms would sell their souls to the British, taking up their dirty work and single-handedly subjugating defiant tribes on their behalf. One such native, noted for his investment in advancing the British agenda and his role in annexing neighboring tribes and kingdoms into the Protectorate, was one Semei Kakungulu, a man who had fought and won several wars on behalf of the British Protectorate, and had distinguished himself as a dependable and formidable force. In 1900, Sir Harry Johnston, the British Special Commissioner to Uganda, gave Semei Kakungulu free rein to advance upon Bukeddi and conquer its people. Johnston had promised to appoint Kakungulu the Kabaka of Bukeddi should he succeed at vanquishing its people. Kakungulu had been provided with plenty of firearms and gunpowder for the mission, and left to his own devices. Eager to escape the hut and gun taxes the British were now imposing upon the natives of Buganda, along with other unfavorable impositions, Kakungulu would have no problems recruiting Buganda youth to join him in Bukeddi. Moreover, the desire to be appointed to prominent positions within Bukeddi, as had been promised by Kakungulu, who by now had established a base in Bukeddi, and was now systematically going about conquering the Bukeddi. Many Gunda, especially those who were Protestants, since Kakungulu at the time was a proclaimed Protestant, or were family members of Kakungulu's, or fellow clansmen, left Buganda for Bukeddi. By some accounts, the exodus of people from Buganda to Bukeddi was so massive that it was noticeable that the populations from which these people came to join Kakungulu and Bukeddi had decreased significantly. In fact, eventually the Protectorate would enact measures in Buganda to slow down this mass migration. Subsequently, matoke, the traditional and staple food of the Ganda, as a sign of the high number of Ganda who had moved to Bukeddi, and an indication of their influence over the region, started to be widely cultivated in Bukeddi. The people of Bukeddi, however, were defiant against Kakungulu when it finally sank in with them that he had intentions of staying permanently and taking them under his conquest. The Baganda he had brought along with him to administer the region did not win him any favors either, and in many cases only deepened the resentment the locals had towards him. Not only were they arrogant and bad-tempered, but their insistence that the locals speak Luganda rubbed the Bukeddi the wrong way. Moreover, some amongst the Protectorate's leadership, including the commissioner at the time, Harry Johnston, who just a year prior had personally been responsible for planting the seed in Kakungulu's mind that he would be made the king of Bukeddi, started getting cold feet about bestowing such honors upon Kakungulu. His reservations were majorly influenced by Buganda's regents, Kagwa, Mugwanya, and Kasingiri, who despised Kakungulu and dreaded the thought of him getting any more glory from the British than he had already gotten, worse yet, being appointed a Kabaka. With the specter of defiance and full-blown resistance by the people of Bukeddi, who were resolved to fight Kakungulu tooth and nail, to stagnate and ultimately debilitate his advancement, coupled by the fact that the British Protectorate was now wavering on not only supporting Kakungulu's mission, but also on their promise to make him king of Bukeddi, Kakungulu was left with a big decision to make. Continue his advance upon Bukeddi, or retreat and cut his losses.